The amber glow of dawn filtered through the cracked window of the boarding house room, casting long shadows across the Winston family's meager possessions. In the cramped space that had become their world, Clara Winston sat on the edge of a sagging cot, mending her only decent dress, the blue one she would wear to her own auction in just a few hours. Her fingers trembled as she worked the needle through the torn fabric, each stitch feeling like a nail in her coffin. Across the room, her father Thomas Winston sat slumped in a broken chair, nursing a bottle of rot-gut whiskey despite the early hour. His bloodshot eyes stared at nothing, lost in a haze of guilt and self-pity that had consumed him for 5 years. "A key," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of the awakening town outside. "Please, there has to be another way." Thomas Winston raised his head slowly, his face a map of broken dreams and failed promises. Once he had been a proud man, a successful rancher with 2,000 acres of prime cattle land and the respect of every man in 3 counties. Now he was a hollow shell destroyed by grief and his own weakness. "There ain't no other way, Clara girl," he said, his voice rough with whiskey and shame. "We owe Kane everything. The boarding house, the food, even the clothes on our backs. He owns us complete." In the far corner of the room, Clara's mother Margaret sat hunched over her sewing, tears dropping silently onto the fabric in her lap. She had aged a decade in 5 years, her once proud posture bent by sorrow and humiliation. She hadn't spoken in 3 days, not since Marcus and James had told her about their plan. The door burst open without warning, and Clara's 2 brothers entered like harbingers of doom. Marcus, at 26, had once shown promise as the heir to the Winston legacy. 5 years ago, he had tried to fill Samuel's boots, working 18-hour days to keep the ranch afloat after their older brother's disappearance. But failure after failure had hardened him into something cruel and calculating. James, 2 years younger, followed in his brother's shadow like he always had. Where Marcus had grown cold and practical, James had become bitter and violent. The loss of their family's status had poisoned him with resentment that festered like an infected wound. "Time to get ready, sister," Marcus said, his voice eerily calm. "Kane's expecting a good show. You don't have to do this," Clara pleaded, standing up from her cot. "We could leave town, start fresh somewhere else. I could find work." "Oh, with what?" James exploded, his face flushing red with anger. "We got nothing. No money, no horses, no future. You think some other town's gonna welcome a family of broke failures?" Marcus placed a restraining hand on his younger brother's arm, but his eyes remained fixed on Clara with the calculating stare of a man appraising livestock. 5 years, Clara," Marcus said quietly. 5 years I've tried to hold this family together. After Samuel died, I took over the ranch work. When Pa started drinking, I handled the accounts. When the creditors came calling, I tried to negotiate. And what did I get for it? He gestured around the squalid room with bitter satisfaction. This, a single room in a boarding house, eating scraps and dodging Kane's collection men. You think I wanted it to come to this? You think any of us wanted it? Clara saw something in her brother's eyes that chilled her to the bone, not cruelty, but resignation. The Marcus she had grown up with, the brother who had once carried her on his shoulders and taught her to rope cattle, was gone. In his place stood a stranger who had calculated her worth in dollars and cents. "Remember when we were kids?" Clara said desperately. "Remember how we used to play by Silver Creek? You said you'd always protect me, Marcus. You promised." For just a moment, Marcus's mask slipped. Clara saw a flicker of the boy he used to be, vulnerable, caring, burdened by responsibilities too heavy for his shoulders. But the moment passed, and his face hardened again. "That was before Samuel died," Marcus said flatly. "Before Pa drank away everything we had. before I learned that promises don't put food on the table or pay debts to men like Silas Kane. Thomas Winston looked up from his bottle, his eyes focusing with difficulty on his children. Kane says if we do this thing, he'll forgive the rest of our debts. We can start clean. You believe that? Clara asked, incredulous. You actually believe Kane will just let us walk away? What choice do we have? Marcus shot back. Kane owns everything, the saloon, half the businesses in town, even the sheriff. He's got us trapped, Clara. This is the only way out. The only way out for you? Clara said, her voice gaining strength. What about me? What about what I want? James laughed harshly. What you want? Since when do women get to choose anything? You'll marry who we say you marry, just like women always have. Not like this, Clara whispered. Not sold like a cow at market. Margaret Winston finally looked up from her sewing, her red-rimmed eyes meeting her daughter's gaze. For a moment, Clara hoped her mother would speak up, would refuse to let this happen. Instead, Margaret just shook her head slowly and returned to her needlework. Clara pleaded, I'm sorry, baby. Margaret whispered without looking up. I'm so sorry. The finality in her mother's voice hit Clara like a physical blow. Even her own mother had given up, had accepted that her daughter was nothing more than a commodity to be traded. Marcus pulled out a pocket watch, their grandfather's gold watch, one of the few valuables they had left. 2 hours until the auction. Best get yourself cleaned up, Clara. Kane wants you looking your best for the bidders. As her brothers left the room, Clara sank back onto her cot, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her family's betrayal. These were the people who were supposed to love and protect her. Yet they were delivering her into the hands of predators, like sheep to wolves. But even as despair threatened to consume her, a small flame of defiance flickered in her chest. She thought of Samuel, her beloved older brother, who had always stood up for what was right. Samuel would never have allowed this to happen. Samuel would have fought, would have found another way. Clara Winston might be trapped, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. 15 miles north of Dead Horse Crossing, in a hidden valley, where the morning mist clung to ancient cottonwood trees, the Lakota camp stirred to life. Smoke rose from cook fires as women prepared the morning meal, while men tended to horses and checked weapons with the practiced efficiency of a people who lived always on the edge of conflict. In the largest teepee, decorated with painted symbols of war and healing, Tokala Grey Hawk knelt beside his younger brother's sleeping form. Chayton, barely 16 years old, lay motionless on a bed of soft buffalo robes, his face flushed with fever, and his breathing shallow and labored. The sickness grows stronger, said Wikapi, the tribal medicine man, his weathered face grave with concern. I have tried all our remedies, willow bark for the fever, echinacea for the infection, sweet grass for the spirits. Nothing works. The evil that burns in his blood is beyond our healing. Tokala placed his hand gently on his brother's forehead, feeling the heat that radiated from his skin like flames from a forge. Chayton had been strong, once a skilled hunter and brave warrior despite his youth. Now he looked fragile as a child, his body wasted by the mysterious illness that had struck him down 3 weeks ago. What do the white doctors use for such sickness? Tokala asked quietly. Wikapi shook his head sadly. There is a medicine, quinine they call it, made from the bark of a tree that grows far to the south. I have heard it can break fevers that kill our people, but it is expensive and hard to find. How expensive? More than most men possess. You would need furs worth $100, maybe more. And even then, the white traders might not sell to us. Tokala was silent for a long moment, watching his brother's labored breathing. Chayton was all the family he had left in this world. Their parents had died in the cavalry raids 5 years ago. Their sister had succumbed to smallpox 2 winters past. The thought of losing Chayton as well was more than Tokala could bear. I will go to the White Town, he said finally. "I will trade for the medicine." Wikapi placed a gnarled hand on Tokala's shoulder. "My son, you know how the whites treat our people in their settlements. They see us as thieves and murderers. Many would rather see you dead than do business with you." "Then I will be careful," Tokala replied. "But I will not watch my brother die when there is medicine that could save him." He rose and began gathering his most precious possessions, the bundle of prime beaver pelts. He had spent 2 years collecting his father's Winchester rifle and his painted war horse, Thunder Walker. Together, they represented everything of value he owned in the world. "You would trade all of this for white man's medicine?" Wikapi asked. "I would trade my life for his," Tokala said simply. As he prepared to leave the camp, Chayton stirred briefly, his fever-bright eyes focusing on his older brother's face. "Tokala," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I am here, little brother. Don't let me die like the others. I'm not ready to walk the spirit trail." Tokala squeezed his brother's hand gently. "You will not die. I promise you this. Rest now and dream of the hunt we will take when you are well." Chayton managed a weak smile before slipping back into fevered sleep. Tokala watched him for another moment, memorizing his brother's face, in case this was the last time he saw him alive. Then he turned and walked out into the morning light, ready to risk everything for a chance to save the only family he had left. The ride to Dead Horse Crossing took him through country that held both beauty and danger in equal measure. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken by mesas and rock formations that glowed like fire in the morning sun. It was harsh land, unforgiving to the weak or unprepared, but Tokala had been born to it, and it held no fears for him. As he approached the outskirts of the white settlement, however, his hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt. Towns were different places where prejudice and fear could turn deadly in an instant. He had no illusions about how the white settlers viewed his people. But Chayton's life hung in the balance, and that was worth any risk. Thunder Walker's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust as they reached the edge of Dead Horse Crossing. Already Tokala could see that something unusual was happening. A crowd had gathered in the main street, and the sound of voices carried on the desert wind. He guided his horse to a hitching post near the general store and dismounted, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. A few townspeople noticed him and whispered among themselves, but most were focused on whatever spectacle was unfolding in the town center. Tokala made his way through the crowd, drawing curious and hostile stares, but no direct confrontation. When he reached the edge of the gathering, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A young white woman sat trapped in an iron cage like a wild animal. Her dress was torn, her wrists bloody from struggling against bonds, and her eyes held the desperate look of someone facing a fate worse than death. She was perhaps 18 years old, with auburn hair and green eyes that swept the crowd with a mixture of fear and defiance. As her gaze met his across the crowd, Tokala felt a shock of recognition. This was the woman who had saved his life 3 months ago by Silver Creek, the one who had risked her own safety to help a wounded stranger. Now she was the one in mortal danger, and he was the only person in the crowd who saw her as a human being, rather than property to be bought and sold. The auction was about to begin, and Tokala Grey Hawk faced a terrible choice: use his precious resources to save this woman, or let her die while he saved his brother. He could not do both. He did not have enough to trade for the medicine and outbid whatever monsters wanted to buy a human being. But as he looked into Clara Winston's eyes and saw the same courage that had prompted her to help him, Tokala knew there was really no choice at all. Some debts could only be repaid with honor, regardless of the cost. He stepped forward, ready to trade everything he owned for a chance to save the woman who had once saved him. The auction began with Thomas Winston's voice cracking like a whip across the desert air, though whether from emotion or whiskey was impossible to tell. Clara sat in the rusted cage, feeling every eye in the crowd, examining her like livestock at market. The iron bars were hot from the desert sun, burning her skin where she touched them. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony of watching her neighbor's people she had known her entire life evaluate her worth in dollars and cents. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," called out the auctioneer, a thin man named Patterson, who made his living selling everything from cattle to furniture. "We have here one fine young woman, age 18, healthy as a horse, and trained in all the domestic arts. She can cook, clean, sew, and has been raised in a Christian household." Clara's cheeks burned with shame at being described like breeding stock, but she forced herself to meet the eyes of the men in the crowd. She would not cower, would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her spirit completely broken. Near the back of the crowd, she spotted Martha Henley, the elderly woman who owned the laundry where Clara had worked for the past 2 years. Martha's eyes were filled with tears, her weathered hands clasped tightly in front of her chest. When their gazes met, Clara saw a flicker of hope. Perhaps Martha would speak up, would find some way to stop this madness. But even as Clara watched, Silas Kane appeared at Martha's shoulder. He didn't say a word, just placed one scarred hand on the old woman's arm and gave her a look that promised terrible consequences if she interfered. Martha's face went white, and she looked away from Clara with the expression of heartbroken defeat. "The bidding starts at $50, Patterson announced. "Do I hear 50? Several hands went up immediately. Clara recognized most of the bidders: Jake Morrison from the general store, Bill Henderson, who owned the feedlot, and half a dozen other men who had watched her grow up and should have been protecting her instead of trying to buy her. 60, do I hear 70? The bidding continued to climb, each increase feeling like another chain wrapped around Clara's soul. She found herself desperately scanning the crowd for any sign of mercy, any face that showed sympathy rather than calculation or lust. That's when she saw him, the Lakota warrior, standing near the general store, watching the proceedings with dark eyes that held no mockery, no hunger, only a quiet understanding of suffering. She recognized him immediately as the wounded man she had helped by Silver Creek, though he looked different now. Stronger, more composed, radiating a calm strength that stood out starkly against the crowd's ugly excitement. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and Clara felt a jolt of connection that transcended words or cultural barriers. Here was someone who saw her as a person, not property. Someone who understood what it meant to be hunted, threatened, reduced to less than human by others' hatred and fear. $100. The harsh voice cut through Clara's moment of hope like a blade. Silas Kane pushed through the crowd with the confident swagger of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. The crowd fell silent as he approached the cage, his scarred face twisted into a predatory grin. Clara's blood turned to ice water. Kane's reputation was known throughout the territory. Women who became his wives either disappeared entirely or were found beaten to death behind his saloon. The sheriff always ruled their deaths accidental, of course. Kane owned too many people in Dead Horse Crossing for justice to interfere with his appetites. $100 cash money. Kane announced, pulling a roll of bills from his vest pocket. Right here, right now. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. $100 was more money than most of these men saw in 6 months. Who could possibly compete with that kind of wealth? Going once. Patterson called, though his voice lacked its earlier enthusiasm. Even he seemed uncomfortable with the idea of selling a young woman to Silas Kane. Clara closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for whatever hell awaited her. At least it would be quick. Kane didn't keep his wives alive very long. Going twice. I offer these. The voice was calm, measured, carrying an authority that made everyone turn to stare. Tokala Grey Hawk stepped forward from the crowd, his arms loaded with trade goods that made Clara's heart leap with desperate hope. He laid a bundle of magnificent furs on a nearby table, beaver pelts, so fine they seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. Beside them, he placed a Winchester rifle that even Clara could see was worth a small fortune. Finally, he gestured toward his painted stallion, a magnificent animal that would be any rancher's prized possession. Indian goods ain't worth spit, someone shouted from the crowd. This is white man's business. But Patterson was examining the trade goods with the shrewd eye of a professional appraiser. The furs alone were worth more than Kane's $100, and the rifle and horse pushed the total value far higher than any cash bid they were likely to see. More importantly, these were tangible assets he could sell immediately, not promises from a man who already owed debts all over town. These goods are worth considerable money, Patterson said slowly. More than the cash bid, actually. Kane's face turned purple with rage. You can't seriously be considering this. He's a savage. The law says any man can bid at a public auction. Patterson replied, though his voice shook slightly. And these trade goods are worth more than your offer, Kane. I'm required to accept the highest bid. For a moment, Clara thought Kane might draw his gun and end the auction with bullets. His hand hovered near his holster, and the veins in his neck stood out like ropes. But there were too many witnesses, too many people watching. Even Kane couldn't murder someone in broad daylight in front of half the town. This ain't over. Kane snarled at Tokala. Not by a long shot. Patterson tossed the cage key to Tokala with trembling hands. The girl is yours. Clara watched as Tokala approached the cage, his movements fluid and careful. When he unlocked the door and held out his hand to her, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected respect. He wasn't looking at his new property, but at a person he was trying to help. You are safe now, he said quietly, and somehow Clara believed him. She took his hand and stepped out of the cage into the blazing desert sun. For the first time in months, she was not someone's property. The feeling was so overwhelming that her knees nearly buckled, but Tokala's steady grip kept her upright. This is wrong. Marcus Winston's voice cut through the crowd like a knife. Clara's brothers pushed through the gathering, their faces red with humiliation and rage. You can't let a savage steal our sister. The trade is complete. Tokala said calmly, moving to place himself between Clara and her brothers. Your father accepted my offer. Our father's a drunk fool. James snarled his hand, moving to the pistol at his hip. We're the ones who need that money, and we say the deal's off. The confrontation erupted into violence with shocking suddenness. Marcus lunged forward to grab Clara, while James drew his knife and slashed at Tokala's extended arm. The blade bit deep, opening a gash from elbow to wrist that sent bright blood spattering across the dusty ground. In the chaos that followed, James's boot connected with the canvas bag containing Tokala's precious medicine for his brother. Glass vials shattered with sounds like breaking dreams, and white powders scattered in the desert wind. Months of careful trading and saving, Chayton's only hope for survival, disappeared in seconds. Clara watched the destruction of the medicine with horror, understanding instinctively what it meant. This man had sacrificed everything, including his brother's life, to save her. The weight of that sacrifice nearly crushed her with its magnitude, but there was no time for gratitude or guilt. Tokala had grabbed Marcus by the throat and was fighting with the desperate strength of a man who had already lost too much. Clara saw James raising his knife again and acted without thinking. She snatched up a rock and hurled it with all her strength, catching him in the temple and sending him staggering backward. A sharp whistle cut through the noise of the fight, a signal that made Clara's blood run cold. 3 horsemen came thundering down Main Street, professional killers, by the look of them, their rifles gleaming in the afternoon sun. Time to go, Tokala shouted, grabbing Clara's hand. Now. They ran. Behind them, Kane's voice rose above the chaos. Bring the girl back alive. Kill the Indian. Clara's bare feet pounded against the hot sand as they sprinted toward the edge of town, bullets whining past their heads like angry hornets. The desert stretched ahead, vast, merciless, and their only hope of escape. The hills. Tokala gasped, blood streaming from his wounded arm. There are places to hide. They ran across the burning wasteland as their pursuers' horses pounded behind them, death riding hard at their heels. The rocky hills rose ahead, like broken teeth promising shelter or a tomb. The first mile across the open desert nearly killed them both. The sun blazed overhead like a furnace, and the sand radiated heat that made every breath feel like swallowing fire. Clara's torn dress provided little protection from the merciless sun, and her bare feet were soon bloody from sharp rocks and thorns hidden in the sand. Tokala was in worse condition. The knife wound in his arm bled steadily, and Clara could see him growing weaker with each step. His bronze skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of serious blood loss, and his normally steady gait had become an uneven stumble. Behind them, the three horsemen gained ground steadily. Clara could hear their harsh voices calling to each other, coordinating their pursuit with the efficiency of professional hunters. These weren't common drifters or casual bounty seekers. They were killers who had done this kind of work before. Can't keep this pace. Clara gasped as they reached a small rise that provided a moment's respite from their pursuers' sight. I must reach the rocks, Tokala replied, gesturing toward the hills that still seemed impossibly distant. Only chance. Clara looked back at the approaching dust cloud and made a desperate calculation. They'll catch us long before we reach cover. We need to slow them down somehow. Tokala followed her gaze and nodded grimly. You are right. But how? Clara's mind raced, drawing on every survival lesson Samuel had taught her during their childhood adventures. Her older brother had been fascinated by military tactics and had spent hours explaining how smaller forces could defeat larger ones through cunning and preparation. The old dry wash, she said suddenly. About half a mile ahead, do you see it? Tokala squinted through the desert haze and spotted the depression. She meant a dried creek bed that would be invisible to their pursuers until they were almost on top of it. Yes. What do you plan? We make them think we're still running straight for the hills, but we circle back through the wash. If we can get behind them, we become the hunters instead of the hunted. Tokala finished understanding immediately. It is a good plan, but dangerous. Everything's dangerous now, Clara replied. They altered their course slightly, angling toward the wash, while maintaining the appearance of a straight flight toward the rocks. The maneuver cost them precious time and energy, but it was their only hope of avoiding capture. The dry creek bed was deeper than it had appeared from a distance, nearly 6 feet at its deepest point, with crumbling banks that provided perfect concealment. They dropped into it just as their pursuers crested the rise behind them, and Clara held her breath as the sound of hoofbeats thundered overhead. Where'd they go? Demanded a harsh voice that echoed off the wash's walls. Had to keep heading for the rocks, replied another man. Nowhere else to run out here. Spread out, ordered a third voice, the leader by his tone of authority. Don't let them slip past us. Clara and Tokala crouched in the shadow of the creek bank, hardly daring to breathe as the horses moved away from them. The plan had worked, but now came the dangerous part, circling back to attack men who were better armed and more experienced than they were. You don't have to do this, Tokala whispered as they prepared to move. You could hide here while I... No, Clara interrupted firmly. We're in this together now. Besides, you're hurt and bleeding. You need help. Something flickered in Tokala's dark eyes, surprise perhaps, or gratitude. In his world, as in hers, women were often considered burdens to be protected rather than partners to fight alongside. But desperate circumstances had a way of breaking down old assumptions. Your brother Samuel, Tokala said quietly. He taught you to think like a warrior. He taught me to think for myself, Clara corrected. Said a Winston never surrenders, never gives up hope, and never leaves a friend behind. They began moving through the wash, using its concealment to work their way back toward their pursuers. The creek bed wound through the desert like a brown snake, providing cover, but also limiting their view of what lay ahead. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they heard voices again, closer now and tense with frustration. "Damn it, Garrett, they couldn't have just vanished," one man was saying. "Shut up and keep looking, Shorty," replied the leader's voice. "They're out here somewhere." Clara felt her blood turn to ice. Garrett, she had heard that name before, whispered in connection with disappearances and mysterious deaths throughout the territory. If this was the same man, they were facing one of the most dangerous killers in the Southwest. Tokala motioned for silence and pointed upward. They had reached a point where the wash curved sharply, and the bank was low enough to climb. Moving with infinite care, they crept up until they could peer over the edge. 20 yards away, a thin man sat on his horse, scanning the horizon with frustrated intensity. His rifle was across his saddle, ready, but not immediately threatening. This had to be Shorty, the voice matched, and he looked like the weakest link in their pursuer's chain. Tokala's plan was simple and brutal. He would circle around and attack Shorty from behind, hoping to capture his horse and weapons before the other two could respond. It was their best chance, possibly. Their only chance. But as Clara watched, she noticed something that changed everything. Shorty's horse was favoring its left front leg, not badly, but enough to slow it down significantly. And more importantly, the man himself kept looking back toward town, rather than focusing on the hunt. He was nervous, distracted, maybe even afraid. "Wait," Clara whispered, grabbing Tokala's arm before he could move. "I have a better idea," she explained quickly, and Tokala's eyebrows rose in surprise. It was audacious, dangerous, and completely unexpected, which was exactly why it might work. Clara climbed out of the wash and began walking directly towards Shorty, her hands raised in apparent surrender. She made sure to stumble and appear weak, letting her torn dress and disheveled appearance tell the story of a desperate woman at the end of her strength. "Please," she called out in a voice designed to carry just far enough. "Please, I can't run anymore. I surrender." Shorty spun his horse around his rifle, coming up instinctively. But when he saw a lone woman stumbling toward him with her hands raised, he relaxed slightly. "Well, well," he said with a nasty grin. "Look what we got here. Where's your Indian friend, honey?" "He left me," Clara said, letting genuine tears run down her cheeks, though not for the reasons Shorty assumed. "When he saw your horses, he just ran. Left me behind like I was nothing." It was a story that fit Shorty's prejudices perfectly. Of course, a savage would abandon a white woman when his own skin was at stake. The man's grip on his rifle loosened as he bought into the deception. "That's what you get for trusting a redskin," Shorty said, dismounting from his horse. "Come on over here, girl. We'll get you back to town safe and sound." Clara walked toward him with deliberately unsteady steps, and Shorty made the fatal mistake of turning his back to secure his rifle to his saddle. That's when Tokala exploded from the wash, like a desert cat covering the distance between them in 3 silent bounds. The warrior's uninjured left arm wrapped around Shorty's throat, while his right hand, despite his wound, grabbed the man's gun belt. Shorty tried to cry out, but Tokala's chokehold cut off his air supply. Within seconds, the man went limp. "Is he dead?" Clara asked, her voice shaking with reaction. "Unconscious." Tokala replied quickly, binding the man with his own belt and rope. "But not for long. We must take his horse and weapons and move quickly." They had gained a mount, a rifle, and precious ammunition, but they had also revealed their position to the other 2 hunters. Even now, Clara could hear Garrett's voice calling for his missing companion. "Shorty, where the hell are you?" "This way," Tokala said, helping Clara mount behind him on Shorty's horse. "We ride for the rocks now, but they will follow. The real fight is still ahead." As they spurred the horse toward the distant hills, Clara held tightly to Tokala's waist and tried to prepare herself for whatever came next. She had just helped capture an armed man, had participated in what could only be called an act of war against Silas Kane's forces. There was no turning back now. She was committed to this path, whatever it led. But for the first time since the auction began, she felt like she was fighting back rather than just running away. The feeling was intoxicating. The captured horse carried them swiftly toward the rocky hills. But Clara could feel the animal laboring beneath their combined weight. Shorty's mount was a good horse, but it wasn't built for carrying two riders across broken desert terrain at speed. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew steadily louder. Garrett and his remaining companion had found Shorty's unconscious form and were coming after them with the single-minded determination of professional manhunters. There, Tokala pointed toward a gap between two towering rock formations. The old mine is just beyond that pass. Clara could see their destination now, a dark opening in the mountainside, surrounded by the rusted remnants of mining equipment and broken timbers. It looked like the mouth of hell itself, but it represented their only hope of escape. They reached the mine entrance just as the first bullets began whistling around them. Garrett and his partner, a barrel-chested man with dead eyes, had closed the distance faster than expected, and their shots were getting uncomfortably accurate. Inside, Tokala shouted, half-dragging Clara toward the tunnel entrance. "Quickly!" They plunged into the darkness, just as a bullet spanged off the rock where Clara's head had been a moment before. The sudden transition from blazing sunlight to absolute darkness left them temporarily blind, stumbling over broken timbers and rusted equipment. "Stay close to the wall." Tokala warned, his warrior's instincts serving him well, even in unfamiliar territory. Old mines are full of death traps, bad air, loose rocks, hidden shafts that drop into nothing. The mine extended deeper into the mountain than Clara had expected, with side tunnels branching off, like the fingers of a skeletal hand. The air smelled of rust decay, and something else, something sweet and sickening that made her stomach turn. Behind them, she could hear their pursuers reaching the entrance, their harsh voices echoing in the confined space. "Garrett, you sure about this?" the barrel-chested man was saying. "These old mines ain't safe. Could be gas pockets, cave-ins, anything." "Shut up, Pike," Garrett replied coldly. "Kane wants the girl, and I ain't going back empty-handed. Besides, they're trapped in there. Only one way out, and we're covering it." Clara felt her blood turn to ice at the mention of Kane's name, but it was the second man's identity that truly terrified her. Pike, she had heard that name whispered in connection with some of the territory's most brutal murders. If this was the same man, they were facing a killer who took pleasure in others' suffering. "We'll smoke them out," Pike said with obvious relish. "Light some torches, fill the tunnels with smoke. They'll come running out soon enough, begging for mercy." "No," Garrett replied firmly. "Kane wants the girl alive and unmarked. We do this quiet and clean." Clara and Tokala moved deeper into the mine, using the sound of their pursuers' voices to navigate in the darkness. The tunnel system was more complex than it had appeared from outside, a maze of passages and chambers that had been carved out over years of mining operations. "Here," Tokala whispered, guiding Clara's hand to a coil of old rope hanging from a support beam. "We can use this." Working by touch alone, they began setting up a simple trap rope stretched across the tunnel at ankle height, secured to wooden supports on either side. It wouldn't stop their pursuers permanently, but it might give them an advantage when the confrontation came. From somewhere behind them came the sound of boots on stone, moving with careful precision. Their hunters were spreading out, trying to cover all the passages and prevent any chance of escape. "I know you're in here," Pike called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Might as well come out peaceful-like. Make this easy on everyone." Clara pressed against Tokala's back, drawing comfort from his steady presence. His wound had stopped bleeding, but she could feel the tension in his muscles as he prepared for what was coming. "Listen to me," he whispered so quietly she could barely hear him. "These men are killers, but they don't know this place like we do now. We have advantages, darkness knowledge of the tunnels, their overconfidence. What do? We hunt them. The word sent a chill down Clara's spine, but she understood the necessity. They couldn't run forever, couldn't hide indefinitely in these dangerous tunnels. Sooner or later, they would have to fight, and it was better to do it on their own terms. Tokala began moving through the maze of tunnels with surprising confidence, his warrior training allowing him to navigate by sound, by the feel of moving air, by senses most people never developed. Clara followed as quietly as she could, marveling at his ability to move silently, even in complete darkness. They had become the hunters now, and their prey didn't even know it. The first encounter came sooner than expected. Pike had separated from Garrett and was working his way through the left branch of the tunnel system, moving with the overconfident swagger of a man who had never met his match. Clara heard him before she saw him, boots scraping against stone, heavy breathing the occasional muttered curse when he stumbled over debris. He was carrying a lamp, and the flickering light announced his position long before he could spot them in the darkness. Tokala's plan was simple and brutal. When Pike came around a bend in the tunnel, he would trip over their rope snare and fall. In the confusion, they would disarm him and use his weapon against his partner. But as Pike approached their position, Clara noticed something that changed everything. Hanging from the man's belt, clearly visible in the lamplight, was a distinctive silver buckle, ornate, engraved, and heartbreakingly familiar. Samuel's belt, the belt their mother had made for her older brother's 18th birthday, decorated with the family cattle brand and his initials. The belt Samuel had been wearing the day he disappeared 5 years ago. The sight hit Clara like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and sending waves of rage and grief crashing over her. This man, this killer, had murdered her brother and kept his belt as a trophy. Tokala, she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. That belt, it belonged to my brother Samuel. Even in the darkness, she could feel Tokala's sudden understanding. This wasn't just about escape anymore. It was about justice for a good man who had been cut down in his prime, about settling a debt that had been 5 years in the making. Pike triggered their trap perfectly, his foot catching the rope and sending him sprawling across the tunnel floor. His lamp shattered against the stone wall, plunging the passage back into darkness and giving them the advantage they needed. Tokala was on him instantly, using his uninjured left arm to pin the man, while Clara searched frantically for his weapons. Pike was stronger than he looked, and even surprised and disarmed, he fought with the vicious desperation of a cornered animal. "Where is he?" Clara demanded, pressing the captured pistol against Pike's temple. "Where is my brother Samuel?" Pike's laughter was cold and cruel, even with a gun to his head. "Your brother, that meddling fool, got exactly what he deserved. Tell me what happened." Clara said, her voice deadly quiet. "Why should I? You're gonna kill me anyway." "Maybe," Clara replied. "But I can make it quick, or I can make it last all night. Your choice." Something in her tone must have convinced Pike that she meant every word. His struggles ceased, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the resignation of a man who knew he was already dead. "Samuel Winston was poking around where he didn't belong," Pike said. "Found out about our arrangement with Kane, the cattle rustling, the forged bills of sale, the whole operation. Threatened to bring in federal marshals if we didn't stop. So you killed him. Shot him in the back while he was watering his horse," Pike said with casual cruelty. "He never saw it coming. Cried like a baby at the end, called out for his little sister to save him." The words hit Clara like physical blows, each one designed to cause maximum pain. But instead of breaking her spirit, they only strengthened her resolve. Samuel had died trying to protect honest ranchers from thieves like Pike and Kane. His death would not be in vain. After we killed him, we made it look like bandits. Pike continued, seemingly unable to stop himself from bragging about his crimes. Scattered his cattle, burned his gear. Then Kane started working on your father-rigged poker games, loaded dice, made up debts. Took 5 years, but we finally got everything. "Including me," Clara said. "You were supposed to be the final payment." Pike agreed. Cain's been wanting a young wife, and you were perfect. Pretty, innocent, completely broken by your family's troubles. I'm not broken, Clara said quietly. Pike laughed again. You will be. Cain breaks all his women eventually. Some last longer than others, but they all break in the end. Clara felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. Not hatred exactly, but a crystalline clarity about what needed to be done. This man had destroyed her family, murdered her brother, and would have condemned her to a fate worse than death. Justice demanded payment, and she was the only one who could collect it. But before she could act, Garrett's voice echoed through the tunnels much closer than before. Pike, where are you? Answer me. Time to move, Tokala said urgently. He struck Pike in the head with the gun butt, knocking him unconscious, then began dragging him deeper into the mine. We can't let Garrett find us here. They moved through the dark tunnels with their unconscious prisoner, Clara's mind racing with plans and possibilities. They had captured one of their hunters and learned the truth about Samuel's murder, but they were still trapped in a dangerous maze with another killer stalking them. The final confrontation was coming, and Clara knew that only one side would walk out of these tunnels alive. Garrett proved to be a more dangerous adversary than either Shorty or Pike. While his companions had relied on brute force and intimidation, Garrett was a true professional patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless. He had found Pike's unconscious form and correctly deduced what had happened. Now he was hunting them with the systematic precision of a man who had tracked down fugitives across half the continent. I know you're listening. His voice echoed through the tunnels, calm and conversational. So let me make you an offer. Send out the girl and I let the Indian walk away. Everyone goes home happy. Clara and Tokala crouched in a side chamber, listening to their hunter's voice bounce off the stone walls. The acoustics of the mine made it impossible to determine his exact location, but he was definitely getting closer. He's lying, Tokala whispered. Even if you surrendered, he would still kill us both. I know, Clara replied. But he doesn't know that we know about Samuel, about the cattle rustling. He thinks we're just random fugitives. What are you thinking? Clara's mind was working furiously, drawing on every tactical lesson Samuel had ever taught her. He's confident because he thinks he has all the advantages, better weapons, more experience, our only escape route blocked. But we have something he doesn't expect, which is the truth. Her plan was audacious and dangerous, but it was also their best chance of survival. If she could get close enough to Garrett to confront him with the evidence of his crimes, she might be able to rattle his composure enough for Tokala to act. Trust me, she said, squeezing Tokala's hand in the darkness. When I give the signal, be ready. Clara began moving through the tunnels, calling out to Garrett in a voice designed to sound defeated and desperate. All right, she shouted. I surrender, I'm coming out. She walked toward his voice, with her hands raised, Pike's gun belt slung over her shoulder like a trophy. When she finally saw Garrett's lamplight, she made sure to stumble and appear weak, letting her torn dress and disheveled appearance tell the story of a broken woman at the end of her strength. Garrett emerged from the shadows with his rifle trained on her chest, but his expression showed more satisfaction than caution. In his experience, desperate women were more likely to collapse in tears than fight back. Smart girl, he said with a cold smile. Where's the Indian? Gone, Clara said, letting real tears run down her cheeks. He left me behind when he heard you coming. Said I was slowing him down. It was the same story that had worked on Shorty, and it seemed to have the same effect on Garrett. His grip on the rifle relaxed slightly as he bought into the deception. That's what you get for trusting a savage, Garrett said, moving closer. Come on over here and we'll get you back to Mr. Cain. Before we go, Clara said, her voice taking on a harder edge, I think you should have this back. She held up Pike's gun belt, making sure the silver buckle caught the lamplight. Garrett's eyes widened as he recognized the significance of what she was showing him. That's my brother's belt. Clara continued, her voice growing stronger. Samuel Winston's belt, the one he was wearing when you murdered him 5 years ago. Garrett's composure cracked for just a moment. Long enough for Clara to see the flicker of surprise and calculation in his eyes. He recovered quickly, but the damage was done. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Pike told me everything. Clara pressed on. How you shot Samuel in the back, how you've been systematically destroying my family ever since. How this whole auction was just the final step in covering up your crimes. Pike talks too much, Garrett said coldly, and Clara knew she had him. So it's true, you did kill my brother. Your brother was a fool who couldn't mind his own business. Garrett snapped his professional mask, finally slipping. He found out about our operation and threatened to bring in federal marshals. We couldn't let that happen. So you murdered him. It was business, nothing personal. And it would have ended there if your family had just accepted their losses and moved on. But no, you had to keep asking questions, keep stirring up trouble. Clara took a step closer, and Garrett's rifle came up to center on her chest again. But she could see the uncertainty in his eyes now, so the growing realization that this wasn't going according to plan. The truth has a way of coming out. Clara said, Samuel's murder, the cattle-rustling Kane's whole criminal empire, it's all going to be exposed. Not if there's nobody left to tell the story. Garrett replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. That's when Tokala struck. The warrior had used Clara's confrontation as cover to circle around through the mine's passages, and now he attacked from Garrett's blind side with the silence of a hunting cat. His uninjured left arm wrapped around the killer's throat while his right hand, despite his wound, grabbed for the rifle. The weapon discharged with a deafening roar in the confined space, the bullet ricocheting off stone walls and bringing down a shower of loose rock. But the shot went wide, and now Garrett was fighting for his life against an opponent who had every reason to kill him. They rolled across the rocky floor, neither able to gain advantage in the flickering lamplight. Garrett was larger and stronger, but Tokala had been trained from childhood in the warrior arts of his people. Even wounded and weakened, he knew how to use leverage and technique to overcome brute strength. Your brother died like a coward. Garrett gasped as they struggled. Begged for his life, cried for his mama. The taunt backfired spectacularly. Instead of rattling Tokala's concentration, it fueled his determination to protect Clara from the same fate that had befallen Samuel. With a surge of desperate strength, he managed to twist Garrett's gun hand and slam it against a sharp rock. The rifle clattered away into the darkness. But Garrett wasn't finished. He pulled a long-bladed knife from his boot, the same knife he had used to finish off Samuel Winston after shooting him. The steel gleamed wickedly in the lamplight as he slashed at Tokala's face. Clara saw the flash of the blade and reacted without thinking. She still held Pike's pistol, and now she aimed it at Garrett's back and pulled the trigger. The shot was deafeningly loud in the confined space. Garrett arched his back and screamed, then collapsed forward onto Tokala. For a moment, neither Clara nor Tokala moved, stunned by the sudden silence. Is he dead? Clara whispered. Tokala pushed Garrett's body aside and felt for a pulse. Yes. Clara slumped against the tunnel wall, shaking with exhaustion and delayed shock. She had just killed a man, shot him in the back to save Tokala's life. The weight of it pressed down on her like a physical burden, but she felt no regret. Garrett had murdered her brother and would have killed them both without hesitation. You did what you had to do. Tokala said gently, understanding her struggle. He would have killed us both. I know, Clara replied, but her voice was hollow. It's just, I never thought I could. You are stronger than you knew, Tokala said. Your brother would be proud. As they made their way out of the mine, Clara realized that something fundamental had changed inside her. She had entered these tunnels as a victim, someone who had things done to her. She was leaving as someone who took action, who fought back, who refused to be anyone's property. The transformation was complete, but she knew the real challenges were just beginning. The desert dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson as Clara and Tokala emerged from the mine's depths. Both were exhausted beyond the point of collapse, covered in rock dust and blood, but alive. Behind them, the tunnels held the bodies of their pursuers and the secrets they had died to protect. Clara still wore Garrett's gun belt with its distinctive silver buckle that had belonged to her brother. It was evidence proof of the connection between Garrett Pike Kane and Samuel's murder 5 years ago. "We have to go back to town," Clara said as they stood in the morning sunlight. "Sheriff Morrison needs to hear this story." "It will be dangerous," Tokala warned. "Kane still has allies. He will not give up easily." "Let him come," Clara replied, and her voice carried a new hardness that hadn't been there before. "I'm not running anymore." But first, they had to survive the journey back to Dead Horse Crossing. They had one lame horse limited water and 15 miles of hostile desert to cross. Worse, Kane would certainly send more men once Garrett and his companions failed to return. The trip took them most of the day, moving carefully to avoid detection, while nursing their limited resources. Tokala's wound had reopened during the fight in the mine, and Clara could see him growing weaker despite his efforts to hide it. "My brother," he said quietly as they rested in the shade of a rock outcropping. "Chayton will die without the medicine." Clara felt the weight of his sacrifice settling on her shoulders. This man had given up everything, his brother's life, his own safety, his precious possessions, to save her from Kane's clutches. "No," she said firmly. "We'll find another way. I have money hidden back in town savings from my laundry work. It's not much, but maybe enough to buy what we need." Tokala looked at her with surprise. "You would do that, after everything your family has done." "My family betrayed me," Clara said. "But you risked everything to save me. That makes you more family than they ever were." They reached the outskirts of Dead Horse Crossing as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. The town looked the same as always, but Clara knew that everything had changed. She was no longer the broken victim who had cowered in Kane's cage. She was someone who had fought back, who had survived hell and emerged stronger. The confrontation with Sheriff Morrison went better than expected. The evidence Clara and Tokala presented, Garrett's confession, Pike's gun belt with Samuel's buckle, and their first-hand testimony about the cattle rustling operation, was too compelling to ignore. More importantly, word of their survival had already spread through the town's rumor mill. The story of how a young woman and a Lakota warrior had outfought 3 of Kane's best killers captured the imagination of people who had lived in fear of Kane's power for too long. Morrison, who had spent years looking the other way when Kane's enemies disappeared, suddenly found himself facing a choice: arrest Kane and risk the consequences, or let the evidence slide and face federal investigators who were already on their way from the territorial capital. He chose survival over loyalty, and Silas Kane found himself in chains before midnight. But Kane's arrest was just the beginning. His criminal empire, built on forged documents and systematic theft, began unraveling as soon as people realized he could no longer retaliate against those who spoke out. Victims came forward, witnesses testified, and federal marshals found evidence of corruption that reached into every corner of the territory's power structure. The Winston family's stolen land was returned to Clara, along with compensation for years of illegal seizure. Thomas Winston, shocked into sobriety by the revelation of his son's murder and his daughter's narrow escape, wept when he learned the truth about how he had been manipulated. "I'm sorry, Clara girl," he said, his voice broken with shame. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you." Clara looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw not the strong rancher of her childhood memories, but a broken old man who had lost everything that mattered to him. Her anger, which had burned so fiercely for so long, began to transform into something closer to pity. "I forgive you, Pa," she said quietly. But I can't forget. And I won't go back to being who I was before. Margaret Winston returned from her sister's house in the east, ready to rebuild what they had lost. But she found a daughter who had changed beyond recognition, someone who had seen too much, survived too much, learned too much about her own strength to be content with the role of dutiful daughter. Marcus and James, their schemes exposed and their reputations destroyed, had fled Dead Horse Crossing in the night. Clara never saw them again, though she occasionally heard reports of two drifters matching their descriptions, causing trouble in distant towns. I want to make the ranch work again, Clara told her parents. But I want to do it my way, with my partner. Tokala had been planning to return to his people, to rejoin his brother Chayton, and the tribal life he had always known. But Clara's offer intrigued him. A partnership between a white woman and a Lakota warrior was almost unheard of, but then again, everything about their relationship had been extraordinary from the beginning. My brother recovered, Tokala said. The fever broke while we were fighting for our lives. The tribal healers managed to save him with traditional remedies, after all. Then stay, Clara said simply. Help me build something new. The Winston Grey Hawk Ranch began operations 6 months later. It was unlike any other cattle operation in the territory, run by a woman and an Indian, employing both white settlers and Native Americans, conducting business based on trust and fair dealing rather than fear and exploitation. The arrangement scandalized some people and inspired others. Clara faced criticism from those who thought a woman had no business running a ranch, while Tokala dealt with suspicion from both whites, who didn't trust Indians, and some tribal members who questioned his partnership with white settlers. But the ranch prospered. Clara's business acumen combined with Tokala's knowledge of the land and animals created a profitable enterprise that became known throughout the territory for its fair treatment of workers and customers alike. More importantly, their partnership became something deeper than business. Not romantic love, neither was ready for that, after everything they had endured, but a profound friendship based on mutual respect, shared hardship, and absolute trust. The first major test of their new relationship came from an unexpected source. Jacob Brennan, a wealthy rancher who had long coveted the Winston land, made several attempts to buy them out at far below market value. When Clara refused, he began a campaign of harassment designed to drive them out of business. Brennan's tactics were subtle but effective. He convinced several suppliers to stop dealing with the Winston Grey Hawk Ranch, claiming it was too dangerous to do business with Indian lovers. He spread rumors about Clara's mental state, suggesting that her experiences had left her unfit to run a business. Most damaging of all, he began approaching their workers with offers of higher wages to abandon their jobs. We could fight him in court, Clara said during one of their evening strategy sessions. We have documents proving our legal ownership of the land. And legal ownership means nothing if we cannot make the ranch profitable, Tokala replied. And Brennan has friends in the territorial government. A court battle could drag on for years. Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the pastures where their cattle grazed peacefully under the desert stars. She had worked so hard to rebuild this place, to create something good from the ashes of her family's destruction. The thought of losing it all to another wealthy bully was almost unbearable. There's another way, she said finally. But it's risky. Her plan was audacious and dangerous, but it played to their strengths while exploiting Brennan's weaknesses. Clara had learned that Brennan's own operation was built on some questionable practices water rights that had been acquired through bribery cattle that bore suspiciously altered brands and workers who were essentially indentured servants. Working together, Clara and Tokala began documenting Brennan's crimes with the same systematic approach that Samuel had once used to investigate Cain's cattle rustling. Clara's knowledge of business practices and legal procedures, combined with Tokala's ability to move unseen and gather information, made them a formidable investigative team. The evidence they collected was damning. Brennan had been stealing water from his neighbors for years, altering brands on stolen cattle, and using violence to intimidate anyone who opposed him. Most shocking of all, they discovered that he had been working with Kane's old network of rustlers, taking over the criminal operation after Kane's arrest. When they presented their findings to the federal marshals, Brennan's empire collapsed overnight. His stolen assets were seized, his legitimate holdings auctioned off to pay his victims, and the man himself fled the territory one step ahead of a hanging rope. The victory established the Winston Grey Hawk Ranch as a force to be reckoned with in territorial politics and business. But more importantly, it proved that Clara and Tokala could work together as true partners, each contributing their unique skills to overcome challenges that would have defeated either of them alone. As the months passed, their partnership evolved into something that transcended the traditional boundaries of race, gender, and social convention. They were building something new, not just a successful ranch, but a community where people were judged by their character rather than their heritage. The transformation was most visible in Dead Horse Crossing itself. Kane's reign of terror was over, but the town still bore the scars of years under his control. Clara and Tokala made it their mission to help heal those wounds, creating jobs for people who had been blacklisted by Kane's network, supporting businesses that had been driven to the edge of bankruptcy, and fostering relationships between white settlers and Native Americans that had seemed impossible just a year earlier. One of their most successful initiatives was a trading post that served as a neutral meeting ground between the white and Native American communities. Tokala's connections with various tribal groups, combined with Clara's business expertise, created a thriving enterprise that benefited everyone involved. The trading post became famous throughout the territory for its fair dealing and quality goods. More importantly, it became a symbol of what was possible when people of different backgrounds worked together toward common goals. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came on a warm spring morning, exactly 1 year after the auction in Dead Horse Crossing. Clara stood in the ranch yard, watching Tokala teach his brother Chayton how to break horses. The boy had grown strong and healthy, his laughter echoing across the pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. A wagon approached from town, carrying a familiar object that made Clara's stomach clench with remembered fear. The rusted iron cage from the auction sat in the wagon bed, abandoned and forgotten behind the courthouse, until Clara had arranged to have it brought to the ranch. "What are you going to do with it?" Tokala asked, joining her as the wagon stopped. "Turn it into something useful," Clara replied. "Something that helps instead of hurts." They loaded the cage onto a cart and drove it to the tribal camp, where the blacksmith's forge burned hot and bright. Working together, Clara, Tokala, Chayton, and several tribal members, they broke apart the iron bars and reshaped the metal. The cage became tools, plowshares for turning soil horseshoes for the animals that carried them across the vast landscape, knives for cutting rope, and leather cooking implements for the ranch kitchen, and even simple household items like ladles and hooks. As Clara watched the flames consume the last recognizable piece of her former prison, she felt something she had never experienced before: complete and absolute freedom. Not just freedom from physical captivity, but freedom from fear, shame, and the powerlessness that had defined her old life. The woman who had once cowered in a cage was gone forever. In her place stood someone who had found her strength through trial by fire, and learned that true freedom came not from the absence of constraints, but from the courage to break free of them and help others do the same. Tokala stood beside her as the forge fire died down to glowing embers, both of them watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed their escape and transformation. They had saved each other in more ways than either could have imagined, and together they had built something new and good from the ashes of their separate losses. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been in town that day? Clara asked as the first stars appeared in the clear desert sky. Tokala considered the question seriously, as he considered all things. "I believe we find the strength we need when we need it most," he said. "You had courage before we met. You proved that by helping me at the creek. I simply gave you a chance to use it." Clara nodded, understanding completely. In a world that had tried to reduce her to a commodity and him to a savage, they had refused to accept those definitions. They had written their own story instead, and it was a story of dignity, courage, and the unbreakable bonds forged between people who refused to surrender to despair. The chains that had once bound her were transformed into tools that helped them plant seeds, harvest crops, and build homes. The transformation was complete. And so was Clara's journey from victim to survivor, to someone who could help others find their own strength. As darkness settled over the ranch and the sounds of night creatures began their ancient chorus, Clara felt truly at peace for the first time in her adult life. She had found her family, not the one she was born into, but the one she had chosen through courage, loyalty, and mutual respect. The Winston Grey Hawk Ranch had become more than just a successful business. It was a beacon of hope in a harsh land, proof that people of different backgrounds could work together to build something better than what they had inherited. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, and Clara smiled. She was free, truly free, and that freedom was something no one could ever take away from her again. More importantly, she had learned to use that freedom not just for herself, but to help others find their own path to dignity and hope. The rusted iron cage was gone forever, melted down and reformed into instruments of hope and productivity. And Clara Winston, once a frightened girl sold by her own family, had become a strong woman who would never again allow anyone to determine her worth or control her destiny. The story had begun with a cage and an auction, with hatred and betrayal, and the worst impulses of the human heart. But it ended with transformation and redemption, with the proof that love and courage could triumph over even the darkest circumstances. It was a story worthy of the vast desert landscape that had witnessed it, harsh and unforgiving, but ultimately beautiful, like the land itself.